Matthew 24 says, "When the Lord comes, one will be taken and one will be left." And many assume that this is talking about the rapture. See, there's so many rapture theories and predictions circulating around the internet these days, especially right now. And usually people base much of their views on Matthew 24. But there's one big misunderstanding that many Christians have about this section. They assume that Jesus is talking about the rapture when he says one is taken and one is left. But if we can figure out who is taken and where they're taken, then we can figure out if this is the rapture or the final coming of Jesus, or something else. And I know this sounds like a wild claim, but in this video, I'm going to walk you through these things as best as I can. And this may just change some of your views about the end times. And that's okay, because it did the same for me. Let's dive into Matthew chapter 24. The big question you're probably wondering is, do you believe in the rapture? And my answer would be, it depends on what you mean. Do I believe we meet the Lord in the air and are caught up with him when he comes back to establish new creation eternally and fully? Yes, I just don't believe Matthew 24 is necessarily talking about this the way that many Christians think. I believe the rapture and the final coming of Jesus to usher in new creation are the same exact event. And so here's another misconception in this series on the end times and the rapture. It is this idea that believers are the ones who are taken in Matthew chapter 24. And you're probably already clicked off. That's all right. For those who want to stick around and actually entertain this idea, and you're open-minded and you're open to being wrong, even with the years of tradition and things that you've been taught, Jesus says in Matthew 24, he says, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So we know what day or time frame, general event he's referring to when he says in verse 40, 2 men will be in the field, one is taken and one is left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one is taken and one is left. Stay awake. You don't know on what day what? Your Lord is coming. And so we know at least what he's referring to when someone is taken and when someone is left is his coming. And as I've argued in each of these previous episodes, you'll have to go watch these if you have not already. I don't believe this is what many people think it is. So usually what happens is people read this and they say believers are the ones taken at the rapture. And they assume a lot about this. You know, this is the rapture. This is Jesus' final coming. These are believers being taken. They look at the whole reference to Noah, you know, as it was in the days of Noah before the flood. That's a parallel. Jesus is letting us know that's a point of comparison. So Noah, you know, he was kind of taken. He's the righteous. And then we'll see in Luke's gospel, in the same discourse, he'll actually reference Lot. So it's not just Lot, or not just Noah, but Noah and Lot. And some people will argue, well, this is Noah and Lot being taken as the righteous, just like Enoch, just like, Elijah. And they'll say the word taken here in Greek it means to be taken to oneself or into one's presence. But I would just like to argue that's not always the case. The word that's translated taken here, I can show you real quick. If it loads, it actually has a pretty wide semantic range, meaning how we determine what the word means is by the context. How's the author using it? What does it mean in this specific context? How's it being, what are the ideas that it's communicating? Those are some things to note. So there is a legitimate translation or usage of this word that means to take to oneself. That is not always the case. So we can't assume that. You can go do that kind of study on your own. But as we're going to see, I'm going to walk you through Matthew's gospel to show you, hey, consistently, when Jesus gives parables, when Jesus is teaching, when Jesus is giving prophecy, in each of these situations, who is it or what is it that is most consistently taken? And what is it or who is it that's most consistently left? And I'm going to show you what I mean, because I'm convinced the ones who are taken here, to show my hand a little early, the ones who are taken are the wicked. The ones who are left are the righteous. Now, if that's the case, then we have some alterations to make to our end times theology and our understanding of the rapture, eschatology, that kind of stuff. So some people, again, will argue that Jesus makes the comparison between the righteous and Noah and Lot, because Noah and Lot were taken. You'll have to stick around to the end for me to address that, because that is its own separate argument that I'll deal with. For now, let me show you why I don't believe Jesus is speaking of some rapture event where the righteous are taken, nor do I think he's speaking of his final coming to establish new creation here, as I've noted throughout this entire series, but that's not the focus here. I want to show you why Jesus cannot be, and I don't think it is, speaking of the righteous being taken here. And if that's the case, then this at least means we can logically conclude it cannot be the typical mainstream view of the rapture, because with the rapture, the righteous are taken up to meet Jesus in the air. But if the righteous are not taken here in Matthew 24, and we can with 99% certainty establish that, which I'm open to being wrong. I've changed my views before. I used to think it was the righteous being taken and it was the rapture, and then slowly with each detail that became clearer and clearer to me. The kind of final straw was the righteous aren't in view there. So we'll start at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, kind of walk our way through and show you every example of something being taken and something being left, and the language that's employed. So the first example is in Matthew 3:10. And again, I want to make this clear. This doesn't mean that, 99% of the occurrences in Matthew refer to the wicked being taken. Therefore, it automatically means in Matthew 24, that's who Jesus is referring to. But we're just building a case to say it seems most consistent, most reasonable to say that in context, Jesus is talking about the righteous that are left and the wicked that are taken. Is that our only legitimate interpretive option? Obviously, there are scholars that argue from both sides. I'm just trying to show you the reasoning from my view. Matthew 3:10, John the Baptist, the wild man that he is, he says, even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees, talking to the brood of vipers. He's saying there's a wrath that's coming, right? And the wrath there is synonymous with the axe being laid to the root of the trees. It's an image for God's divine judgment. Every tree, therefore, that doesn't bear fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. You might say it's taken away, okay? This is consistent with the language Jesus will employ when he uses this same kind of analogy. In Matthew 7, talking about false prophets, which John is directly addressing with the self-righteous, prideful religious leaders of his day, Jesus says every tree that doesn't bear good fruit is actually cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. And so Jesus kind of elaborates on the analogy of John to say that, yes, the nation of Israel is its own kind of entity. That's what the tree represents, and it's about to be cut down with the temple and everything. But also people are individually trees, and they are taken away and thrown into the fire. Okay. Now you say, well, the word taken isn't there. It doesn't have to be. The concept is pretty clear. When you throw something into the fire, you're taking it away to the place where it's being destroyed. Matthew 7:27 says, the rains fell and the floods came, the winds blew and beat against that house. You're probably familiar with the parable of the house being built on the rock and the house being built on the sand. That's what Jesus is talking about here. And the winds blew, beat against that house. There are flood waters and rain and wind, and this house falls. Now, the best way to understand, to be consistent with the Old Testament images of judgment and floodwaters and sometimes armies representing a kind of flood of judgment, is that those people, the wicked, this house that falls is indeed swept away by the flood. Kind of like the wicked of Noah's day. They are swept away, and we'll get to Noah in a little bit. But you're starting to see the idea of something being taken or removed or, being swept away. It is consistently, or falling, it is the wicked. Matthew 8:12, Jesus says, the sons of the kingdom, that being the unbelieving Israelites of his day, they will be thrown into outer darkness. You might say taken away. Translated from one place into another is what it means to be removed and taken. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Right, so apparently the sons of the kingdom are thrown into the outer darkness. Now this language intensifies throughout the parables of Jesus and Matthew, like it escalates from here. Matthew 11:22 through 23, he says, I tell you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. And he's talking directly to the cities he did most of his miracles in. And he says, Capernaum, one of the cities, will you be exalted to heaven? The answer is, it's a rhetorical question, no. You'll be brought down to Hades. And then he shifts and he talks about Sodom. Look at what he says. So in other words, Capernaum is like the house that we saw that isn't built on the rock and it crumbles, it falls, great is the fall of it. Yeah, Capernaum will be brought down. If the mighty works done in you had been actually done in Sodom, think Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, like it would have remained. And I just want us to take note of that, because by the time we get to Lot, the language Jesus uses indicates that Sodom technically was taken. Sodom does not remain. Who did remain in the land of the living once judgment came upon Sodom and Gomorrah? Was it the people of Sodom? No, it was Lot. He remained. You can say, well, he was kind of raptured by the angels, taken out of the city, but that's not the totality of the event. That's a micro moment within the grand scheme of judgment, but that's not the total way of looking at God's judgment there. Essentially, you have people who are taken. Sodom is taken away, destroyed by fire from the heavens. Lot remains in the land of the living by God's grace to answer Abraham's intercessory prayer, right? And so Sodom would have remained. We'll get to that when we get to that. Matthew 12:29. How can someone enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man? In context, Jesus is talking about casting out demons, right? When Jesus removes a demon, he's plundering the strong man, taking back his goods, which is the human host, right? And casting that demon out. You can say the house being plundered is the person that the evil spirit has possession of. Once Jesus comes in as the stronger man, removes that demon, the demon is cast out or removed or taken away. Matthew chapter, and in that context, it refers to an evil being, not a person. Matthew 13:12, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and they're wondering why he talks in parables. And part of his answer is, to you it's been given to know the secrets of the kingdom, like understanding, spiritual revelation. Why? Because they asked, not because of some arbitrary choice of God. It's because the apostles asked for understanding and approached Jesus. But to these crowds, it has not been given, presumably because they did not ask. For to the one who has this understanding, more will be given. He'll have an abundance. From the one who has not, and this becomes a statement of judgment, what he has will be taken away. Which is to say, any, knowledge of the gospel, any proximity to this good news, any, connection you might have with my daughter going off in the background, any, knowledge and revelation that these people have, if they don't believe and trust and conclude what they should about Jesus from this knowledge and revelation, none of that will be helpful. It'll be taken away at the end. And it's faith that saves, not knowledge, not information, not just this, revelation of God. It's what you do with it. Do you trust? Do you believe? Do you have faith? And it's the same language used in Matthew 25 with the parable of the talents. The similar statement is made about the man who didn't do anything with the talent he had. Jesus says, the master in that parable, to everyone who has will more be given, and he'll have an abundance. Like if you're faithful with little, you'll be faithful with much. God will entrust you more, right? So faithfulness is not determined by how much you know, but by what you do with what you know. It's not based on the knowledge of the Torah you have or the understanding and revelation you have access to, but what you do with it. So from the one who has not, even what he has will be what? Taken away. It's been a long time coming, but the new edition of my book Fruitful is officially available in both paperback and digital version. It's perfect for small group discussion, church-wide discipleship, or even just your own personal faith. It lays out the clear gospel, your identity, your purpose, and God's process for your life. So grab your copy on the homepage of my website or sample the first chapter on Amazon. Or if you like reading on your devices, snag your digital copy on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Apple iBooks. I believe it will absolutely bless you and strengthen your relationship with God. All right, let's get back to the video. Now, again, it's a statement of judgment. Something being taken is happening to the wicked. And to be clear, in verse 30, it says, cast the worthless servant into outer darkness. So that servant is removed and taken away from the faithful ones. By the way, it only gets more clear with each parable, in case it's been it's a little cryptic, I don't see it. Matthew 13:40, Jesus talks about the parable of the wheat and the weeds. The weeds are gathered and burned with fire at the end of the age. Jesus turns around and gives, what does this represent? The Son of Man will send his angels. They will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and lawlessness and throw them into the fiery furnace. They are taken away. Same kind of fiery weeping and gnashing of teeth language used of these other parables where someone is taken. There might be different language that surrounds this general place of judgment where the wicked go, but they're almost like synonymous terms. You'll see weeping, you'll see gnashing of teeth, sometimes differences in the way Jesus describes this place. But in other words, it's not where the righteous are taken. The wicked are taken away to that place, while the righteous, they remain and shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. This gets even clearer in verse 48. Jesus gives a parable of the kingdom. It's like a net gathering in all kinds of fish. The good and the bad fish represent good and bad people. At the end of the age, he says the angels will come out and separate or take away the evil from the righteous. And what does he do? What do they do with the evil? They throw them into the fiery furnace. Again, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. The bad fish are taken. The weeds are taken. The faithless servants are taken. The trees that are fruitless are taken. The house is taken away. The sons of the kingdom are taken away. In every example and case, except one which I'll address at the end, which has nothing to do with any of this. It just happens to be the word taken. In every example, whatever is taken refers to wicked people, the evil, or in context is a judgment coming on them. Matthew 18:34, talking about the unforgiving servant, Jesus says this servant will be delivered to the jailers by the king until he pays all his debt. In other words, this unfaithful, unforgiving servant is taken away and brought into prison. And I don't think that's a stretch to say that. He is translated from one place to another, which is typically how the rapture is viewed in some way. Not brought to prison, but translated from this realm to the next. Matthew 21:21, Jesus answers, and I find this interesting. Okay, I just wanted to consider. Everything that's taken, cast out, removed, refers to the wicked. Now, when Jesus talks about the fig tree that just withered up, he parallels this to a mountain. And I don't think he's just talking about some general mountain that symbolically represents an obstacle to overcome or an impossible situation in your life. But he might have an eye towards the specific mountain of Jerusalem, which I've noted in a couple episodes. I said, I think Jesus is actually talking about the mountain of Jerusalem and that holy place, which is, symbolized by the temple, and Israel identifies with that. That's where their hope and value and sense of safety is wrapped up in. That mountain of God currently is going to be cast down. And Jesus says, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, it will happen. So either way, a mountain is taken up, cast into the sea. I liken this to Jerusalem, and kind of like what we see in chapter 9, where the demons fill pigs and they plummet into the sea, which is the place of chaos, the place from which, you have evil spirits kind of arising, or the abyss that evil spirits are sent into. Matthew 21:41 through 43, there's the parable of the wicked vineyard tenants. Jesus kind of turns to his audience and he says, hey, after these vineyard tenants kill the son of the owner, like when the owner actually comes, what do you think he's going to do to those current tenants, which Israel represents? And they said to him, he's going to put those wretches to a miserable death, and he's going to let out the vineyard to other tenants who will actually give them their fruits in their seasons. So what we have here is something being taken, right? The vineyard is taken away from the current tenants, given to another people that actually produces the fruits. And it's not just that, but verse 41 says he puts those wretches to a miserable death. They are taken away from the vineyard to be killed. To be put in the place of death, the Sheol, the place of the dead. And on top of that, the kingdom is taken. Jesus explicitly says, the kingdom is taken from you and given to a people producing its fruits. So whether it's the wicked being taken or an act of judgment against the wicked, something is taken from them, it seems to always consistently indicate the same underlying point, that it is not good to be taken, which we get to Matthew 24, and suddenly we're like, we want to be taken. You don't. To be consistent with Matthew's gospel and what Jesus says, you don't want to be taken. Matthew 24:51, there is a servant that essentially is like, you know what? Forget my master. I'm going to do whatever I want. He says, my master's delayed. Okay, think Israel at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses is taking too long. Let's build a golden calf. So we have a wicked servant who's like, I'm going to do what I want. He begins to beat his fellow servants. He eats and drinks with drunkards. The master of that servant comes on a day he didn't expect, and he cuts him in pieces and puts him with the hypocrites. In other words, takes him away, places him in a different location, right? He goes from one location to another, and he's placed with the hypocrites in the jail, in the place of the dead, in the place where, there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. Whatever the place ends up being, however you describe that place, you don't want to be there. In Matthew 25:10, you have the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins. Now, usually, people take this parable and go, but this one is the rapture. This one is the final coming of Jesus. And I'm more inclined to think, if anything, it's referring to the final coming of Jesus to establish new creation. I don't think it's the rapture, though, because the righteous here, they seem to be the ones that are taken, right? And I'll read it in a minute, but it seems to be the closest you get to any hint of the rapture in Matthew. But the language isn't that the righteous or the wise virgins are taken, it's that they went in. And some people go, same thing, don't muddy the waters. And I go, well, technically, if you read the parable, you have the foolish virgins. All of a sudden, both the wise and the foolish are sleeping. Bridegroom comes, unexpected. He's a little later than we thought. But the wise are ready. The foolish look at the wise and go, give us some of your oil. We don't have enough for our lamps. And the wise answer and go, there's not enough for us and for you. Like, you go buy for yourselves. And while they were going to buy, you might say while they go away, the bridegroom comes and those who are ready go with him. They went in with him to the marriage feast. Doesn't necessarily say they're taken, which you can imply, duh, they're taken. But I want you to notice something, okay? Afterward, the other virgins come and say, Lord, Lord. And he goes, I don't know you, right? So it parallels Matthew 7. But the point is, technically, the foolish went away first. Then, once they were gone, the righteous are brought in, or they stay. And this is consistent with every other image we've seen. There is first a removal of the wicked, or the unbelieving, or the unrighteous, or the unprepared, or the unfaithful, whatever. And then the righteous are taken in. So even this supposed rapture parable doesn't necessarily indicate that the righteous are taken and the wicked are left, because the wicked they go away first. Matthew 25. Parable of the talents, you're familiar. One guy didn't do anything with it, and we saw this. He's cast into outer darkness. You might say he's taken away. And I think the evidence is overwhelming to say, yeah, the wicked are the ones who are taken, not the righteous. In Matthew 25, you have the goats on the left and the sheep on the right. Jesus looks at the wicked, or the goats, on his left, and these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. So the wicked are taken away into eternal judgment. Well, you go, well, the righteous are taken away into life. Let me show you why I don't believe that's the case by taking you to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5 tells us that technically the meek, they inherit the earth. And this is a very common Old Testament concept. This would not be foreign to the Hebrew Scriptures. The meek, or the righteous, inherit the earth. They're not taken from it. They actually inherit it. They stay. And then in Matthew 5:12, you have the salt of the earth. If that salt loses its taste, it's good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underneath people's feet. A statement of judgment, as we've consistently seen. The ones who are thrown out, taken away, removed, are always the wicked, just like this tasteless salt that Israel has become. So the only other example I found, okay, that seems to be I hope I have stacked up the evidence so clearly and so obviously to make the case for the fact that when we get to Matthew 24, it's not the righteous being taken. That would be very interesting. But Matthew 9:15, the only other concept of something being taken, Jesus talks about fasting. He says, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? No. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away. So that refers to the ascension of Jesus, or the death, or both, right? So either way, that's just a completely different idea than the concept of judgment coming upon someone. You can say technically Jesus was judged for our sin in our place. But by the time you get to Matthew 24, verse 41 and 42, who's the one being taken? To be consistent with what Jesus continually says about who's taken and who's left, it seems pretty clear that Matthew 24 corresponds to the same two categories Jesus has used every time in each of his parables or his teachings about someone being taken or someone being left. Now, a few passages to consider. Hebrews 12:27 talks about the kingdom that lasts versus the kingdom that doesn't. 1 Peter 1:25 talks about the word of God remaining. John 8:35 says the son remains in the house. Matthew 11:23, we already saw Sodom and Gomorrah remain if they had turned, Galatians 4, though, is a good passage to go to. It contrasts Hagar, which represents this category of those who are of the flesh, of works under law. And then you have the children of Sarah or Isaac, who are of faith and promise and righteous. So he says, look, you brothers like Isaac are children of promise. And just like at that time, he who was born according to the flesh, Ishmael, he persecuted Isaac. So it is now. Like, this is what you should expect. Like, kind of the fake Israelites are persecuting the real spiritual Israel. Well, what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son. The son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So cast out, remove, take away the ones who identify with the law under, condemnation and sin and refuse to believe in Jesus. And throughout the Old Testament, in judgment, destruction, and evil, what's left typically are those who are alive on the earth, the righteous. Those who are taken are the unrighteous and wicked. So what Jesus is saying is not foreign to the Old Testament prophecy or what judgment we see in the scriptures. Think about Rahab, she's left. Think about, any other example. But Noah comes up. Because in Matthew 24, Jesus says, those days will be like the days of Noah. And this is where people go, but Noah was taken away in the ark. So he is even with all the examples you've given us, Noah was taken. Well, if I take, pun intended, this away from you, you have nothing else to lean on now. Let me show you the language. All flesh died that moved on the earth when the floodwaters came. All mankind, every creature, everything on the dry land and who had the breath of life died. He blotted out. You might say removed every living thing, took away everything that was on the face of the ground. And you go, well, that's a stretch. Don't insert your ideas into the text. Look at what it says. They were blotted out from the earth, taken away from a location, removed from a location, a realm. Only Noah was left. Not taken, he was left, and those who were with him in the ark. So if you want to use Noah's story to be like, he was taken, false. Genesis doesn't say that. Genesis wants you to think about Noah surviving as Noah being left to inherit the new world. Not taken, he's left. The wicked are blotted out or removed. Now Lot and Noah were both left on the earth to continue in the land of the living, while the wicked around them were taken away from the earth. It's consistent with Lot. Jesus himself says, if Sodom believed, they would have remained. They wouldn't have been taken away. Now you can kind of read into Lot was taken by the angel. That's not the totality of the event. That was a moment in time. In the actual, sequence of events, that was one of the specific moments. Hey, Lot was taken, but then he also had to go to a city that were in the mountains. He still had to do a double escape. But either way, he's left on the earth. Sodom is taken away. Jesus said if they believed and saw the signs, they would have remained instead of being removed. So something else for you to consider. There's this right and left hand motif in Matthew's gospel that I think corresponds to the taken and the left, which is why I think you should examine Luke 23, 31 through 43, Matthew 27, 27 through 31, Matthew 20, 21, and Matthew 25, 34. Those would be good scriptures. And the reason I brought in Lot was because in Luke's account of this whole taken and one being left, what you have is not just a reference to Noah, but a reference to Lot. He went out from Sodom. That's the rapture. That's him being taken. That's the righteous being removed. Now that's Lot going out, the way that Noah went into the ark. It's really that simple. The act of, faith or trust, which the angels, of course, take Lot. He's kind of taking his time, dragging his feet, but he was still going out, just taking longer than he should have. Either way, there are these actions of faith, and it prompts this, hey, you're saved. You're left on the earth in the land of the living while the wicked are taken away. I don't know how else to get I don't know how one would get around that, but you can let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Hey, this is Jason from the future. I was reviewing the footage and completely forgot one of the strongest arguments in Luke chapter 17 for why I believe that Jesus is indeed telling us that the wicked are taken away and not the righteous. In Luke 17, the same account or the same discourse, but in Luke's gospel, Jesus says, I tell you, in that night there will be two in one bed, one will be taken and one will be left. And this is like almost word for word what Matthew's talking about in chapter 24. But as we've said, Matthew organizes his data topically, combines both discourses that Luke separates in Luke 17 and 21, and then Matthew just places in 24. And Jesus, talking about the same thing, he is in chapter 24, says one will be taken and one will be left. There will be two women grinding together, one will be taken and the other one will be left. And they said to him, where, Lord? And notice they are asking specifically, where is this one that is taken going to be taken? They're asking locationally where this person is brought to, not where they're left. Obviously, they're left where they're left, but where are they taken? And then Jesus says, where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. In other words, the place of the dead. And we talked about that in the previous episode. You can go watch how we broke that down with the vultures and the eagles and the dead corpse and Israel becoming a kind of dead host of sorts. So Luke's account is very specific, kind of with the abomination of desolation, kind of like that, where it's like, see the armies surrounding Jerusalem. But in Luke's account, the disciples clearly ask where. I don't know if you could say that they're asking where's the person left, but where's the person taken seems to be more likely. And if that's the case, Jesus is essentially saying where you expect dead things to be. So I hope this is helpful. In the next video, we're going to look at another one of the bigger myths about Matthew 24. I know we were supposed to get into the fig tree in this one. I decided not to do that. I apologize for the confusion. But in the next one, we'll finally end the series on the rapture and the kind of rapture craze that's going on. And we'll wrap this up with, hey, in what ways are these days in Matthew 24 like the days of Noah? And to be clear, the reason we say, okay, the one who's taken is the wicked and the one who's righteous is left is because that can't be the rapture then. I don't know how you can say that is still the rapture and say the righteous meet the Lord in the air when it's clearly the wicked being taken in that context. So what is that coming? I think to be consistent with what I've been saying in the previous episodes, it is judgment on Jerusalem through the Roman armies. You can leave your disagreements and thoughts in the comments. I'd love them if you'd be kind and respectful. I'll see you guys in the next video. Hey, if you're not a monthly supporter yet of this ministry, here's why you'll want to become one today. You get access to exclusive teachings every week. Right now, I'm going through Genesis, looking at the Hebrew and drawing out deeper insights. You'll get access to all of my biblical parallel worksheets. And there are other benefits for higher tiers, like unlimited access to all of my sermon notes, free access to paid Bible courses, and even early access to weekly Bible teachings. So go check that out on the website, and thank you for supporting this ministry to help us teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. I'll see you in the next video.